They say marriage is the promise of a fresh start, but I learned in Chelsea that it is often the promise of an ending. It wasn't love that was missing between James and me. It was air. The air to breathe, to stand on our own, to decide our own lives without the icy breath of his mother, Lady Caroline Harrington, dictating every single inhale. The real tragedy, you see, never erupts in fireworks. It builds slowly, in the silence of elegant sitting rooms, caught between fine porcelain and the looming threat of a century-old inheritance. James and I had moved into an apartment so perfect, it was almost impersonal, on the third floor of a red brick mansion block near Kings Road. The antique oak floorboards creaked just enough to remind you there was history, and the sash windows filtered a soft winter light that I loved to capture with my camera. It was our nest, our sanctuary, or almost. The rent, the furnishings, and a good portion of our provisions came from a blocked account, managed by the Harrington Family Trust. In other words, by Lady Caroline. She was everything I was not. A lady of the old English guard, obsessed with lineage, the right schools, Eton, Oxford, naturally, and, above all, order. I was Eleanor, Ellie, an art photographer whose only fortune lay in her eye and her autonomy. But James's love for me was, I was convinced, my true wealth. He was gentle, self-effacing, and, as I know now with chilling clarity, terribly weak. Our engagement ring was a muted ruby surrounded by diamonds, an antique piece from the Harrington legacy. It was magnificent, but I had never been able to feel it was mine. Every time I looked at it, I saw not James's promise, but the weight of Caroline. I remember feeling it one rainy afternoon, heavy and cold, as if it was burdened by all the expectations of the London aristocracy. The wedding preparations began like a pastel dream, only to devolve into a black and white nightmare. We had found the venue, a magnificent manor house in Wiltshire. We had hired the vendors, reserved the rooms, sent the invitations. Invitations she had forced to be written in an archaic English script, naturally. The budget was colossal, the majority coming from the Harrington pocket, and that is where the trap closed around me. I recall one particular afternoon, 6 months ago, in her Belgravia townhouse. The air smelled of sandalwood and reproach. We were seated in her study, hands resting on a dark oak table that was far too shiny. She was reviewing my choices for the rehearsal dinner, a list I had spent hours refining. "The beef Wellington, Ellie," she said in a monotone, without lifting her eyes from the sheet. "It's too vulgar and far too heavy for a dinner of this significance. I thought we would opt for the pheasant, as my mother did. It is tradition, you see." I felt that familiar heat, the dull eruption behind my rib cage. "We discussed the menu, Caroline. The Wellington is what James and I both love. It's our wedding!" She finally raised her eyes, thin, piercing gray slits, and looked at me, not with anger, but with condescending pity, which was far worse. "It is James's wedding, dear Ellie, and allow me to remind you, the one my money is making possible. I am not dictating, I am guiding, and my guidance is always aligned with what is acceptable." I remember the smell of overbrewed Earl Grey tea and that whisper in my mind telling me to get up and leave. James, of course, remained silent, lost in observing an old family photograph on the wall. He was looking at the past, incapable of facing the future. I should have seen it as a sign. The final confrontation occurred 2 weeks before the fateful date, at the caterer's tasting in Wiltshire. We were sampling the dessert, a citrus creation, my choice, which she contested, insisting on a more classic Yule log. The key point of contention was the inclusion of two friends from university, people who were as dear to me as brothers, whom she had crossed off to add a pair of associates from James's investment fund. "I regret it, Ellie," she announced, dabbing her lips with a linen napkin. "But strategic choices must be made. Those friends bring nothing to the event. They have neither status nor utility." My heart stopped beating. not from pain, but from that cold clarity one feels when faced with absolute injustice. James was there, tasting a bite of the dessert, his gaze evasive. The air grew so thin. I saw the caterer and the pastry chef, professional and discreet, but whose embarrassment only added to my humiliation. That is when I spoke the words that sealed my ruin, and, in retrospect, my liberation. I leaned over the table, my hands gripping the wood so hard my nails left faint indentations. My voice was a whisper, but a whisper so charged it resonated louder than any scream. Caroline, please, for once, stay in your lane. This is our wedding, not your networking tool. I looked her straight in the eye. The word your was a knife. She didn't scream at me. She didn't even make a scene. She simply placed the napkin down, without hurry, without emotion. She signaled the caterer to pack up the rest of the dessert and rose to her feet. You have made your choice, Eleanor. I hope you stand by it. It was a promise that came to fruition the next morning at 7:12 a.m. The email was short, almost surgical, sent by her personal secretary and copied to James's barrister. Subject: Withdrawal of financial support. Given Miss Eleanor Smith's blatant display of disrespect toward the principal benefactress of the event, the Harrington family finds it necessary to withdraw the entirety of its financial contribution to the wedding of Mr. James Harrington and Miss Smith. All funds and pledges of payment are hereby revoked with immediate effect. Regards, Sterling and Jones Chambers, barristers. My blood ran cold. I remember rereading the line, my hand, shaking so hard that coffee splashed onto the laptop screen. She hadn't just cut the cord, she had employed a scorched earth policy. The ensuing chaos was a descent into hell. The Wiltshire Manor, alerted by her lawyers, canceled the booking. The caterer demanded the remaining balance of the deposit, threatening legal action. The musicians, the florists, the printers. Everyone was waiting for their money. Sums we did not possess, because we had placed all our trust in her promise. James, faced with the disaster, did not explode. He imploded. My mother. She never bluffs, Ellie. You should have. He stopped himself, unable to say the word. I should have kept silent. I finished for him, my voice strangely calm. He looked down, staring at the Persian rug Caroline had chosen for us. She has the means to ruin us, Ellie. The means to take everything. It was at that precise moment that I realized the deepest betrayal. Not Caroline's, whose antagonism was clear, but James's, who had chosen gilded servitude over my integrity. He hadn't sided with his mother, he had sided with the money. The wedding was publicly canceled. The shame was a viscous substance I could almost feel on my skin when I went out onto the streets of Chelsea. The whispers, the glances from his friends' mothers, all of whom knew Caroline's version. But shame transformed into a cold, crystalline determination. I hired a small, tenacious lawyer specializing in complex contractual disputes, the kind of person the Harringtons would never have considered confronting. We had nothing left to lose. Our goal was no longer to save the marriage, it was to save my honor, and to make her pay the price of her malice. We sued Caroline, not for the wedding money, but for the damages caused by the abusive breach of contracts signed with third parties. It was the only possible angle, the only one where money was a tool of destruction, not a gift. Preparing for the trial took weeks. I put my photography career on hold. I remember spending an entire night sorting invoices in the kitchen, the harsh light of the bulb reflecting off the ruby ring, which I no longer had the heart to part with. It had become my burden, the proof of the debt. One evening, I found a photo of Caroline and James, taken on his graduation day at Oxford. They stood straight, with the same air of cold superiority. I shivered. It was the photo of a duo. James was merely an extension of her, an instrument of her authority. I realized then that I wasn't just his fiancé, I was the usurper. It is the kind of pain that leaves you unnervingly calm. You reach a point where there are no more tears, just a glacial lucidity. I knew that to defeat her, I couldn't attack her on an emotional level, but on a strategic one. James spent his evenings in silence, often at a friend's place, leaving me alone with the disaster she had created. He didn't understand, didn't want to understand, that this battle was for his, freedom as much as for mine. And then there was the dress. Ah, the dress. The most expensive, the most heavily symbolic object, and the one on which Caroline had undoubtedly most fantasized about seeing me depend. The dress had been my secret, a secret I had kept even from James, not out of spite, but because it was the only thing that was entirely mine, independent of their funds or their judgments. A few months earlier, I had entered a competition organized by a luxury fashion magazine and a couture house. I had to submit our love story, our greatest obstacle, and explain why we deserved a bespoke gown. I had written a 20-page letter about the difficulty of navigating between respect for tradition and the need for personal sovereignty, never naming Caroline, but describing with acerbic irony the pressure of lineage. I had won, a dress valued at over £8,000, a dress I had designed with the stylist, made of heavy silk crepe, without lace or embellishment, a pure and modern line. It was the dress of a queen, not a princess. I had kept it at my sister's place, in a locked wardrobe in Bath. The only document I kept on me was the sponsorship contract, a clause stipulating that the gown was a non-refundable gift in exchange for social media content. It was my masterpiece, my ace in the hole. The day of the trial arrived. The courtroom was packed, a theater of marble and dark wood, the light filtering through tall, dusty windows of the High Court of Justice in London. The public was there, the curious but also familiar faces, acquaintances of the Harringtons, who had come to witness the spectacle of my defeat. Caroline arrived draped in an absolutely chic tweed suit, her posture stiff and her face impassive, as if she were merely an audience member at a poorly written play. James sat near her, small and trembling. He looked at me only once, a gaze full of plea and fear. I looked away. I already saw him as a stranger. My barrister argued forcefully about the damages caused to third parties by malice. Caroline's lawyer responded with the usual assurance of the powerful, minimizing the act as a mere cancellation of a pledge of donation, and accusing me of provoking the breakup. Then Judge Sterling, a man with gray hair pulled back and a weary gaze, turned to me. It was time for the solo performance. "Miss Smith," he began, his voice coldly echoing, "the heart of this matter, beyond the deposits, resides in intent, the intent to ruin." Lady Harrington withdrew all funds, with the foreseeable effect of canceling your ceremony and putting you in legal jeopardy. Your barrister has included this high-value wedding gown in the table of losses. He leaned forward. The silence was absolute. You could almost hear the slow, steady rhythm of my own heart beating. "Lady Harrington," the judge continued, "did she threaten this dress? Did she suggest you could not afford it without her aid?" "She presumed, Your Honor," I replied, my voice perfectly steady, icy. "She presumed I depended on her for everything of value or importance." The judge put down his pen. He glanced at Caroline, whose mouth was a thin, hard line. Then he returned to me, hitting where it hurt the most, where Caroline's money was supposed to have ascendancy. "Very well, but for Lady Harrington's action to be perceived as an act of complete sabotage, this symbolic item would have needed to be threatened, miss. Who specifically paid for the gown? Who signed the check?" Caroline smiled. A small, imperceptible movement of the lips, a Pyrrhic victory, but a victory nonetheless. She knew that even if I had paid for it, I would have had to go into debt. She expected the confirmation of my vulnerability. I paused, a moment that lasted an eternity. I thought of the heavy silk crepe, of my sister who had kept it safe. I thought of the moment I said, "Stay in your lane." It wasn't an insult. It was a boundary line. "Your Honor," I said, my eyes fixed not on the judge, but on Lady Caroline Harrington. The dress was paid for, yes, but not by a personal check, nor by any aid from my in-laws. I saw the shadow of doubt cross Caroline's face. It was, I continued, allowing myself a deliberate slowness, graciously gifted by Modern Bride magazine and the St. James Couture House. I won it as part of a national competition for what they deemed an exceptional love story. I handed my barrister the sponsorship contract, which he immediately presented to the court. The judge read the clause, once, then twice. The effect was immediate, visceral. The judge, though typically composed, first let out a small, resonant ah. He lowered his head and laughed. Not a discreet chuckle, but a deep, throaty laugh that shook his robes. Then the public followed. A murmur of disbelief swelled, turned into a hysterical whisper, and exploded into bursts of laughter that filled the courtroom. The audience wasn't laughing at me. They were laughing at Caroline. They were laughing at the perfect irony. The most costly sabotage of the ceremony had been rendered totally futile by my ingenuity. The centerpiece, the item of highest value, had been beyond her financial reach from the very beginning. Caroline's economic weapon had become her public humiliation. That's when I looked at James. He didn't laugh. He was sitting next to his mother, his hands clasped, and he began to weep. His tears were not mine. They were the tears of a man who realized his mother's pointless malice and, more painfully, his own smallness. He was mourning the irreversible destruction of his family, the collapse of his identity, the end of the tutelage. He was crying because my victory sounded his failure. He hadn't been my protector, but a hostage. Judge Sterling finally regained his composure, wiping the corner of his eye. He declared that Caroline's act, by withdrawing all funds after promising full support and knowing that contractual penalties would be incurred, constituted an abusive breach of trust. "Lady Harrington," the judge said, his voice now harsh, "you will be held responsible for all contract cancellation fees incurred by the couple and will cover all of the plaintiff's legal fees. This court has found that your action aimed at the complete destruction of a ceremony that, curiously, only depended on you for its accessories. The gown, the item of highest value, was secured by Miss Smith's ingenuity. Case dismissed." I walked out of the courtroom into the blinding London sunlight. I did not look at James. I did not look at Caroline. I did not need a verdict to know that the wedding was over, and that my life with James was, too. He caught up to me on the steps, touching my arm. His tears had left faint damp patches on his shirt. "Ellie, I'm sorry. So sorry." I pulled my arm away. There was no more anger, just the terrifying calm of acceptance. "I know, James. So, what do we do?" I looked at the ruby on my finger, the ring of heritage, of control, of lack of heir. I gently removed it and placed it in his hand. The stone was cold. "What we do, James," I replied, my voice a stream of icy water, "is I go to Bath and collect my dress. I will have it photographed, and I will post it on my social media with the note that I won it. Not just the dress, but my sovereignty." He looked at me, devastated. He said nothing. He knew it was too late. I saw in his eyes the choice he had made in the kitchen, when he let his mother ruin me. I walked away, never looking back. I traversed Chelsea, the elegant, ruthless city that had been the stage for my defeat and my triumph. I smelled the hot asphalt, the distant sound of horns, and for the first time in months, I breathed air that belonged to me. Air that was not funded by a Harrington trust. I posted the photo of my dress a few days later. The pure silk, the perfect line. I didn't mention the court, the check, or the tears. I just wrote a simple, definitive caption. Winning is not always about money. Sometimes it's about the story and honor. The gown, the one I never wore for a wedding, became the perfect symbol, the symbol of poetic justice, and the judge's laughter, the sound of Lady Caroline's fall. If stories like this linger with you, stay. True elegance is never in wealth. It is in revenge, served cold and elegant. Subscribe, and let's uncover the next secret waiting in the dark, one confession at a time.